The Opium Wars were two wars that took place in China in the middle of the 19th century. They were fought between the armies of Western countries and the forces of the Qing Dynasty, which controlled China from 1644 until 1911–12. The First Opium War took place between China and Britain from 1839 to 1842, while the Second Opium War took place between Britain and France against China from 1856 to 1860. This conflict is sometimes referred to as the Arrow War or the Anglo-French War in China. In every instance, the foreign powers emerged victorious, acquiring China's trade privileges as well as legal and territorial concessions. The wars signaled the beginning of an era characterized by unequal treaties and other incursions into Qing authority. The Opium Wars began when China attempted to put a stop to the flow of opium across its borders. During the 18th century, foreign merchants, largely British, had been illegally transporting opium, principally from India to China. Nevertheless, beginning around 1820, the scale of this trade began to significantly increase. The widespread addiction that resulted in China was causing major social and economic disruption in that country. During the spring of 1839, the Chinese government seized and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of opium, which equated to over 1,400 tons of the drug. These opium shipments had been warehoused at Canton, Guangzhou, by British merchants. In July, a drunken incident involving British sailors resulted in the death of a Chinese farmer, which exacerbated the tensions between the two groups. The British government, which did not want its people to be tried in the Chinese legal system, did not want to give the accused men over to the Chinese courts. Later on in the same year, hostilities broke out as a result of the destruction of a Chinese blockade of the Pearl River, Zhujiang, estuary in Hong Kong by British vessels. The decision to deploy an expeditionary force to China was made by the British government early in the year 1840, and they arrived in Hong Kong in the month of June. After months of discussions in Canton, the British fleet moved up the Pearl River estuary to Canton, and in May 1841, they attacked and seized the city after having been there for so long. Despite a vigorous counterattack by Chinese troops in the spring of 1842, other British campaigns in the following year were also successful against the inferior Qing forces. These campaigns took place throughout the course of the next year. Nonetheless, the Brits were able to hold out against that attack and take Nanjing, also spelt Nanking, at the end of August, which brought an end to the conflict. The Treaty of Nanjing was finally signed on August 29, and as per its terms, China was obliged to make a sizable indemnity payment to the British government, hand up Hong Kong Island to the British, and expand from 1 canton to 5 the number of treaty ports in which the British were permitted to trade and dwell. Shanghai was one of the 4 extra ports that were designated, and the fact that it was now open to foreigners signaled the beginning of the city's transition into one of the most important commercial entrepots in China. The British Supplemental Treaty of the Boe-Guman, which was signed on October 8, 1843, conferred extraterritoriality to British citizens, which is the right to be tried by British courts, as well as most favored nation status. Britain was granted any rights in China that might be granted to other foreign countries, and thus the Western nations quickly made the demand too. They were granted the privilege shortly as well. In the middle of the 1850s, when the Qing government was preoccupied with putting down the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted for the next decade, the British, who were interested in expanding their commercial rights in China, found an excuse to resume their hostile relations with China. Around the beginning of October 1856, a group of Chinese officials boarded the British-registered ship Arrow while it was parked in Canton. They imprisoned a number of Chinese crew members, but they were eventually freed, and they supposedly lowered the flag flying above the ship, which was British. In the later part of that month, a British cruiser sailed up the estuary of the Pearl River and began bombing Canton. There were also clashes between British and Chinese troops during this time. As a result of the impasse that developed, trading came to a halt. During the month of December, the Chinese in Canton set fire to foreign companies, which led to an even more escalation in tensions. The French government made the decision to participate in the British military expedition in early 1856, citing the murder of a French missionary deep within the interior of China as their justification. However, the Allies did not begin their military activities until late 1857 due to the fact that there were delays in the assembly of the forces in China. British troops that were en route were initially diverted to India to assist in putting down the Indian Mutiny. Nonetheless, they soon took control of Canton, removed the city's governor who was uncooperative, and replaced him with an official who would be more cooperative. In May of 1858, coalition forces embarked on British vessels and made their way to Tianjin, also known as Tinsin, where they pressured the Chinese into entering into discussions. The treaties of Tianjin were signed in June of 1858 and provided for the residents of foreign envoys in Beijing, the opening of several new ports to Western trade and residence, the right of foreign travel in the interior of China, and freedom of movement for Christian missionaries. The import of opium was made lawful as a result of subsequent talks that took place in Shanghai later that year. In the summer of 1858, the British pulled out of Tianjin, but they came back to the area in June 1859 on their way to Beijing with French and British diplomats to sign the treaties. They were not permitted to get around the Dagu forts that were located at the mouth of the Hai River, and the Chinese suggested an alternative path to Beijing. The British-led forces came to the conclusion that pursuing the alternative route was not the best option and instead attempted to advance past Dagu. However, they were pushed back, suffering huge casualties in the process. After that, the Chinese government decided not to ratify the treaties, and this led to the Allies restarting their offensive. In August of 1860, a far bigger force of warships and British and French troops destroyed the Dagu batteries, advanced upriver to Tianjin, and in October of that same year conquered Beijing and plundered, and then torched the Yuanming Garden, which served as the emperor's summer house. Later on in that month, the Chinese promised to obey the treaties of Tianjin and signed the Beijing Convention, in which they also gave to the British the southern portion of the Kowloon Peninsula that is next to Hong Kong. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.